All right, I think we'll begin. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this very important and timely AEI program on how we can both have less crime and less incarceration. My name is Robert Dorr, and I am the Morgridge Fellow in Poverty Studies here at AEI, and this seminar is one in a number of events and gatherings that we have had to discuss issues of particular importance to low-income Americans. No group benefits more from less crime and can be hurt more by too much incarceration than poor Americans. Our co-host and driving force behind this event is my colleague Sally Sattel, who is a resident scholar here at AEI. We have a great panel, which our moderator, Steve Tellis of Johns Hopkins, will bring up in a moment. But first, I have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker, Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner of the 5th Congressional District of Wisconsin. Congressman Sensenbrenner has been a great leader on criminal justice issues since he came to Congress in 1979. He represents the area around Milwaukee, has been the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, and is now the chair of the Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, Homeland Security, and Investigations. We are very honored to have you here today, Congressman Sensenbrenner.
Thank you very much, Robert, and thanks to all of you for coming. I want to thank AEI for hosting this event on such an important and timely topic, criminal justice reform. In recent months, we have seen a number of members of Congress and organizations from across the political spectrum come together and recognize that our judicial system is flawed. Too many of our prisons are clogged with nonviolent offenders who are serving excessively lengthy sentences. Facilities are well beyond capacity and costing taxpayers $80 billion a year. Meanwhile, Congress continues to steadily increase the size and scope of the federal criminal code. This does our country a great disservice. Beginning in the spring of 2013, I chaired the House Judiciary Committee's Overcriminalization Task Force. Over the course of a year and a half, the task force thoroughly examined issues relating to the scope of mass incarceration, the dramatic growth of the federal criminal code, and evidence-based programs for reform. We heard from groups and organizations as diverse as the Families Against Mandatory Minimums, Right on Crime, Heritage Foundation, and the ACLU, an eclectic bunch, if any. And all of them recognize the need to respond to reduce the size and cost of federal corrections policy. Over the past 3 decades, America's federal prison population has more than quadrupled. Prison spending has increased by 595%, a staggering figure that is both irresponsible and unsustainable. And yet this increased spending has not yielded results. More than 40% of released offenders return to prison within 3 years of release, and in some states, recidivism rates are closer to 60%. Several studies have found that at a certain point, high incarceration rates become ineffective and actually cause the crime rate to go up. Especially among low-risk offenders, long prison sentences increase the risk of recidivism because they sever the ties between the inmate and his family and community. These severed ties are at the heart of the moral case for reform. It's not just the people in prison who are paying the punishment for their crimes. Mass incarceration tears families apart and deprives children of their fathers and mothers. It likely means the loss of a job, possibly a home, and any support he or she had within the community. And that's where we are with our sentencing policy today. We're spending more, we're getting less, and we're destroying communities in the process. The system is broken, and it's our job to fix it. There is a better way. In recent years, 27 states, particularly conservative, deeply red states, have enacted substantial reforms to their criminal justice systems. Cumulative cost savings to these states exceed $4.6 billion. Many of the states have also seen a corresponding drop in crime. Their experience proves that we can reform the criminal justice system without compromising public safety. This brings me to the legislation that I introduced in June with Congressman Bobby Scott of Virginia, entitled the Safe Justice Act, a truly bipartisan bill which addresses both the front and back ends of our criminal justice system. But it does so in a targeted way, rather than with across-the-board cuts. It is an evidence-based approach that draws heavily from the successes of numerous states which have led the federal government in adopting comprehensive reforms. The Safe Justice Act focuses on transitioning prisoners back into the community after they have served their time. It requires that each inmate undergo a risk assessment to evaluate his or her risk for recidivism. It incentivizes participation in programs such as job training, substance abuse, and mental health counseling. Those who successfully complete programming would then be able to use the credits to serve out the final days of their sentences under community supervision or home confinement. In addition, the Safe Justice Act will, 1, rein in rampant overregulation by federal agencies by forcing reviews of regulations with criminal penalties. Just as an aside on this, I would say that about 2.5 years ago, Mr. Scott and I sent a letter to CRS asking for the number of these types of criminal penalties that are attached to government regulations, not bills that were passed by Congress. CRS responded that they didn't have the staff to be able to give us a number where they were and what they were. The number is so vast. So we propose to review them and have the agencies tell us what they want to do. Now, second, the bill forces drug mandatory minimums on leaders, managers, supervisors, and organizers of drug trafficking organizations rather than low-level offenders. Third, it improves government accountability by charging the Department of Justice and the Bureau of Prisons with collecting key outcome performance measures. We don't know very much about that now, and we need to have better data. Expand the use of alternative sentencing like probation, drug courts, medical treatment for addiction or mental illness, and finally, to provide law enforcement with critical tools to keep communities safe by expanding access to training, safety equipment, and health and wellness. Our system cannot continue on its current trajectory. It's not only fiscally unsustainable, but morally irresponsible. Now is the time for criminal justice reform, and the Safe Justice Act delivers the change necessary to enact fairness in sentencing, reduce taxpayer burden, and ensure the increased safety and prosperity of communities across the country. Thank you very much for coming here today, and if we have time, Robert, I can answer a few questions. Let me say I do have to split soon because the whole voting pattern on Iran, the wheel has fallen off because Congressman Roscoe of Illinois is making the point that the clock is not ticking because the administration has not disclosed the side agreements, and the clock only ticks, according to Mr. Roscoe, once the entire deal is put before Congress. So how this is resolved is to be determined. So who has questions on this rather than Iran? Yes, sir.
Thank you so much for coming, sir. I wanted to see if you had any thoughts on the school-to-prison pipeline and particularly status offenses for juveniles.
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is we have to do major reform on this. School-to-prison pipeline, is something that is going to have to be addressed, I think, from the bottom up rather than from the top down. And, I'm not willing to say that this program is effective or not at this point in time. I think we have to put all of the pieces of the puzzle together and then to see which pieces of the puzzle are the most effective. Now, obviously what we have to do is to prevent people from going to prison in the first place. And that's going to require a change in social attitudes, and it's going to be harder to accomplish, in my opinion, than giving people who are in prison the tools to prevent them from being repeat offenders. But there has to be a prison prevention program in terms of this entire package. And let me say we have less data on how to put that together so that we can get the maximum bang for the taxpayer's dollar. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Lia. Thanks for your effort in this area. It's wonderful. But
Thank
I
you.
would like you to know the justice system issue not just cover the prison by itself, because now what they define prison is including hospitals and rehab center and what else. And a lot of veterans or black and brown or maybe even Islamic group, they are sent to prison and maybe they were causing their death. It's not suicide, it's homicide. And then maybe some other unjust medication or injection. So I just wonder if you can expand your effort to cover all this.
Well, let me say that probably the biggest scandal of the VA over-prescribing psychiatric drugs occurred in my state at the hospital in Tomah, Wisconsin, where there was a doctor who was given the nickname the Candy Man, who was over-prescribing various types of psychiatric drugs, and there were some deaths that resulted in that. And hopefully the VA is looking at other doctors in other parts of the country and other hospitals that are doing that and putting a stop to that, because that certainly, in my opinion, is medical malpractice. Now, having said that, let me say that there is a significant amount of money in this bill that will be allocated to mental health activities. And there are some people who go to prison that have committed crimes as a result of mental health problems. There is also legislation that is being sponsored by Congressman Tim Murphy of Pennsylvania, who in his life before Congress was a clinical psychologist, that is attempting to address this issue before people with mental health problems get involved in the criminal justice system. That's the way to go about it, but it's not within the four corners of the bill that Mr. Scott and I have represented or have introduced, and part of the reason for that is a jurisdictional issue, because I found from my time as chair of the Judiciary Committee that the more committees you have a bill referred to, because there's such a potpourri of issues that are in the jurisdiction of many committees, the more committees you have a bill referred to, the less likelihood is that it will be passed and signed into law. So sometimes you've got to narrow what you want to do in order to get anything done. And getting anything done in Congress is not very easy. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Elaine Middleman. I'm a practicing attorney, and
Yeah.
there's been so much litigation about what's the residual clause and what's a violent felony under the ACCA, and also whether other sentencing guidelines amendments are retroactive and can be applied to 2255s. Is there any way Congress can, when they pass something, make it so that there aren't more questions left to be answered by the courts?
Well, I'm aware of those as a member of the Judiciary Committee. What I can say is I get very wary of biting off more than one can chew in drafting legislation. Each of the issues you have mentioned, I think, are important issues, but I'll be very practical in saying that the biggest obstacle to the bill's redefining mandatory minimums and getting rid of a fair number of mandatory minimums is the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Grassley of Iowa. And if we pass a bill that does too much and Grassley ends up saying no way, no how, and I don't want to talk about this anymore, then nothing is going to happen. I want to have something happen, and I want to get at the root causes, which are a lot sociological, but a lot about the fact that too many people are getting involved in the criminal justice system, and when they do get out of prison, there is too much of a revolving door. Remember, prisons are in polite company called correctional facilities. Well, there's not too much correction that is going on in the correctional facilities. And I think what we're aiming for is those that do end up there, even with revised mandatory minimums, there are more efforts made to correct them so they don't go back. I have time for about one more. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Andrea King. So I've been a subcontractor with Bureau of Prisons, Court Services Offender Supervision Agency, United States Probation Office, and DC Jail. And one of the things I've noticed is that in the Washington, D.C. area, we already do substance abuse, mental health, many of the things that you all are mentioning that are happening in states. So we already kind of know what works and what doesn't for us. One of the things that I'm seeing after doing this for about 15 years is that when the offenders re-enter society, they usually, there's a weak work and economic development force for them. They can't get sustainable incomes, and then they also go back into major metropolitan areas where they face gentrification and high cost of living. So I was wondering if you could address that, and then if you could...
Well, let me address that first, and then you can ask a follow-up. Otherwise, I'll be a run-on, and nobody wants that, beginning with you. Let me say at the outset that one of the things that will go on within the correctional facility would be a more intensive effort on vocational training, so that when they get out, they will have the skills that an employer would hire them. We're going to have to deal with the employment community, because if somebody shows up as a convicted and released felon, usually that puts several red lights on in the HR office's mind, as saying, do we really want to have a person with that kind of a background working with people who have never run afoul of the law? So we're going to have to do that. But I think what we want to do is we want to give them skills while they're in prison, so that they can do something productive as soon as they get out of prison. And then maybe if they can do something productive, they won't sit around and hang with the people who got them into prison to begin with, meaning their old friends who are still involved in criminal activity. So that's going to be the effort that we're going to be making. Now, the other thing that goes along with this is the amendment of the mandatory minimum laws, particularly nonviolent laws where somebody is not involved in trafficking, but if you have a little bit more of a banned substance, you're ended up presumed to be trafficking. What we want to do there is where somebody is arrested and is not subject to a mandatory minimum and is put on probation by the sentencing judge, is to have probation departments be much more proactive in saying, just don't check in with us once a week. Have the probation officer work with that person who is on probation, and that's going to require the hiring of more probation officers.
You have that in the DC agencies.
Mm-hmm.
The issue is, again, the job piece, and going back to what you said about the vocational piece, what we also know is, according to BOP stats, is that there's a low participation rate. So one of the things I've asked that several other judiciary agencies is, why aren't they coming out of their cells? And I think it's connected with high assault rates at maximum, minimum, and low-level security.
Mm-hmm.
But whatever the reason is, they're not coming out for the vocational programs, and most of the vocational programs that I talk to people about,
Yeah.
at the one and only halfway house we have here in DC, are very dated. So you can't teach people bricklaying skills when it's not a lot of brick houses in DC.
Yeah, the thing is that I understand that. What Congress does is it sets policy. how effective the policy is and whether or not Congress's intent is being carried out by an agency of the executive branch or by a grantee is something that Congress will have to follow up on later in discharging its oversight functions. Now, when I was chair of the Judiciary Committee and prior to that chair of Science Committee, I took my oversight responsibilities seriously, to the extent that I canceled an appearance by Attorney General Ashcroft when he gave the committee staff his testimony an hour before the hearing was supposed to start. And there was no way that either the members or the staff could read it, digest it, and draft intelligence questions of the Attorney General. He was a little bit upset at me when I did that, but I said, we do have a rule that the testimony be filed 24 hours in advance of the hearing so that we can be prepared to do our job, and we might even let you know what kind of pointed questions are coming your way in advance. So it all depends upon what kind of a committee chair that you have, both of the full committee and in the subcommittee, on whether there's aggressive oversight. And while my principal portfolio as subcommittee chair is crime and terrorism, the oversight function is also in there in the quote investigations unquote. And the Over-Crim subcommittee did an awful lot of investigating, so we kind of switched from one hat to the other on that. And what you're hearing now is about policy, is about funding. And the thing is that we can save an awful lot of money by reducing the prison population of nonviolent offenders. And we can use that money for what I refer to as the sociological issues that have been presented with our current broken down system. Now, how that money is specifically spent and whether it will be spent in an effective manner will be up to DOJ and some of the other agencies to do. But I can tell you, as long as I'm in Congress, I'm going to be looking over their shoulder to make sure that they're doing what the intent of Congress is. And you may recall that last year and early this year, I was looking over the NSA's shoulder, and they got their wings clipped. As the author of the Patriot Act, they were doing something that Congress never intended, and they can't do it anymore.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now have our next panel up. You okay, Congressman?
Yes, I'm fine.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. No, I've got to go
All right,
away.
Peter, Steve, take it over. All right, you're in charge.
I've got to run, so thank you.
Slide on by. Good luck with the panel. Stay right here.
All right, good. Okay. All right, places everyone. All right, so while everyone gets settled in, Sally, you're over there. I am Steve Tellis from what the university public relations department requires that I refer to as the Johns Hopkins University, not to be confused with the other one. I am currently working with my graduate student David Dagan on finishing a book called Prison Break: Why Conservatives Are Changing Their Mind on Criminal Justice, and there really would be no better indication of that change than the address that you just heard. I think it'd be easy to be able to defend the claim that 10 or certainly 15 years ago, you would have not heard a speech like that from any member of Congress, maybe short of Ron Paul. And that the fact that a member of Congress is powerful, as Congressman Sensenbrenner would give a speech of the kind he just said, very openly admitting to the harm created by mass incarceration, with an optimistic attitude toward the possibility of reentry, signals an enormous change in the politics of criminal justice. And it's that change in the politics of criminal justice and the change of conservatives in particular that I think has opened up the gateways to many of the changes that we've seen in states and that we may very soon be seeing in the federal government. That is, again, if you look at the change in what conservatives are saying now and 15 or 20 years ago, conservatives standing at podiums like this would have said that nothing worked in terms of reentry. They would have said that long sentences were the best way to reduce incarceration. They would not have been saying, for example, as Congressman Sensenbrenner did, that incarceration is something that produces harm to families and to the, in fact, to the incarcerated individual themselves. All of those things are things that conservatives can say and are saying today in a way that they weren't before. That said, this optimism that's produced by the fact that conservatives are now part, and in fact, in many cases, leading the march for criminal justice reform, comes up against the fact that that many of the menu of options we have in terms of actual policy that we've been using so far may not get us to where we need to go, may not get us to the more ambitious measures to reduce incarceration while preserving public safety that many advocates would like. And that's why we have the panel today. All of the panelists are really going to be asking the question about how do we reduce incarceration, how do we, while also preserving public safety, and how do we add to the menu of options that are available to policymakers. We have a stacked panel today of experts. I'm going to go very quickly. You have all their bios. Sally Sattel is a psychiatrist. She's also in charge of the coerced abstinence program that is being done on my smoking habit right now. So she herself is, in fact, doing an experiment in keeping people off of substance abuse, namely me. She is the author of numerous books, including PCMD and The Case for Coerced Treatment. David Kennedy is, I'm not shy to say, is one of my heroes. He also worked very closely with James Q. Wilson, who for a long time was one of the leaders of AAI. He is a professor at John Jay College, and many of you'll know as the innovator behind the idea of Operation Ceasefire, which has successfully reduced crime and incarceration in numerous cities. The only one in which maybe it's been less successful is sadly Baltimore, which is a story unto itself for many reasons. Adam Gelb is the head of the Pew Public Safety Performance Project. I've gotten that wrong on more times than I'd like to remember. Adam has been at this for a long time, going all the way back to the time when he staffed the 1994 crime bill, for which he is in a durable state of penance. And finally, Janet Malcolm is John Malcolm is a fellow at the Heritage Foundation, has been a Assistant Attorney General, Deputy Assistant Attorney General, and has worked at the Motion Picture Association of America, which I imagine was probably the most entertaining of his various different stints. So we will start with Adam, followed by David, Sally, and then John doing cleanup. Thank you.
Thank you. Sally, what are the sanctions that you are applying when he smokes when he's not supposed to be? What's the program
Charge him
here?
more.
Social disapproval.
That's right.
Well, so thank you. And I think the place to start, appreciate getting the starting role here, is to just pause a second and recognize that crime and incarceration actually are going down. They're both going down. They're both going down together, and that's been the case for about 5 years now. I think it's important to do that because, one, I think there's a lot of advocacy that gives the impression that imprisonment still is rising, actually. And if you don't pay somewhat close attention, that's what you're going to hear, that prisons are increasingly crowded and that the population and the imprisonment rate are growing. Been falling since it peaked at about 1 in 100 back in 2007, 2008. Related to that, crime has been on a 20-year plus slide now, but when we've done polling and asked people, you get somewhere around 42% of people who think that crime is actually still increasing, and this is before the stuff in the last few months this summer. So a lot of perceptions out there that crime and imprisonment both are rising. They're actually both they're both falling. And that's really important because it was an article of faith for so long in this country that in order to keep crime headed down, prisons had to keep growing, right? There was a sort of X-inverse relationship that was assumed. And in fact, they're both headed down. I've got a quick illustration. I don't know what's going to happen when I click that magic. We actually have seen larger increases, I should say larger decreases in the crime rate in states that are reducing their imprisonment rates over the past 5 years than in states where the prison population continues to grow. So just pause on that and look at that for a second. Really counterintuitive. Crime falling faster where prisons are falling faster than the other way around. It's always nice to note when Texas and Massachusetts are doing something in the same direction. If Texas and Massachusetts, you got something going on there that's worth taking note. And just to pull out those two examples, imprisonment rate down about 10% in Texas between 2008 and 13, crime rate down 18%, and you see the 12 and the 14 for Massachusetts. Don't take from this that prisons don't have anything to do with crime. I think our perspective is that the best research out there shows that about 25%, maybe as much as 25% of the crime drop that we have enjoyed since the early 90s is due to increased incarceration. However, the flip side of that, of course, is that the other 75% plus has come from other factors, right? And some of those are government policy. David can talk about better policing that's gone on in many places that would be responsible for some of that crime drop. Some doesn't have anything to do whatsoever with government policy. There's a lot of theories out there about why crime has dropped. One of the interesting non-government theories is that there are just a lot more people staying home, whether that's because of unemployment or telecommuting, young men not going out and getting jobs and moving back in with their families, and so breaking into places and stealing things is harder to do than it was, and there's sort of more deterrence there. What is clear is that we did pass a point of diminishing returns, and maybe that was here on the slide where we got in 2007, 2008 to a point where 1 in every 100 adults in this country was actually behind bars. Maybe it was before that, we don't know exactly when, but for this past 5-year period, at the end of that chart, we see both of these things dropping. All right, so this is not theoretical, it's actually happening. You can reduce crime and incarceration at the same time. Moving to Steve's question here about, so how low will we go? Will this continue? I think there are 3 major things going on that suggest that it will continue, and these are really the driving forces behind the reforms we're seeing in the states. And then there are also 3 factors that suggest that it's going to be really tough. So in order, the first is the success of states in moving policy in this direction, right? So this is the first positive thing going on. I think you have some materials in front of you, not this map, but look at this map in terms of showing that over 30 states at this point have now enacted some type of criminal justice reform, starting with Texas back in 2007. What you do have in your materials is the votes that have occurred in these states. And that's the next slide here, but just pause on this for a second and note that all of these blue states are states that, in our view, have enacted some type of comprehensive reforms aimed at focusing prison space on violent chronic offenders and reinvesting some of the savings you get from removing those lower level offenders back into community supervision and other programs and attempts to reduce the recidivism rate. That's the basic formula that's been applied in most of these states. Lots of variance, of course, in what they've actually done. But blue states, comprehensive efforts to do that. Yellow states, less comprehensive effort. And then you see a few that are actually at work right now on packages for the 2017 session. So more than 30 states have done this kind of work. And most of them have done it with very lopsided votes. You see the tallies here. We've got for these legislative packages, almost 6,000 votes for for them and less than 500 against. So strong bipartisanship in the states moving in this direction. Second wind blowing in the right direction is the development of effective, credible alternatives. You know, when, whether it was back in '94, the crime bill, or certainly back in the '70s when we sort of got started on this prison building path, we did not know very much about what worked to redirect the lives of offenders and how to deal with them. We didn't know very much. Today we know much more, no magic bullets, but research has shown a variety of interventions with offenders and a process for dealing with offenders, starting with risk assessment and moving people into the right type of programs that specifically target their criminogenic factors, understanding what those risk factors are in the first place. So we're not targeting low self-esteem when in fact it's poor impulse control that is a much more tightly correlated with criminal behavior, and so on. Sally and David may talk about some more of the interventions, particularly Hope-style, swift and certain responses, both positive and negative, to behavior, rather than a system that waits and waits and waits until somebody screws up a dozen, 2, 3 dozen times. And then lowers the boom on them and sends them back to prison. So we've learned a lot about this, and the research shows it clearly, and policymakers are starting to get it now. It's not that the research has shown up in just the last 5 years or so, although I would say in the last 15 or 20, there's been a real explosion of solid research. But policymakers are now getting it, that there is something that you can do, the proverbial something else, with these lower level offenders that is credible and will actually bend the recidivism curve. Third reason, if we have the successive states and we have solid research, we also have a very supportive public environment at this point. Money is important in this, and I think it might be naive for folks to think that whether it's the Hill or out in the States that tight budgets over the past few years haven't had anything to do with this, but it's also a real mistake to assume that people are coming to this, including particularly conservatives, purely from a fiscal perspective. There's lots more going on here, whether it's a spiritual, biblical approach to this, or a moral approach, a public safety approach. People at this point, quite frankly, are sick and tired of rhetoric around public safety. They realize at this point that we're not going to build our way out, and they're much more interested, and it's fascinating in the polling that we've done, much more interesting much greater interest of people that we reduce recidivism than that we try to hold offenders for longer sentences. They take that trade-off in the high 70s, high 80s across party lines. I think I got a slide on public opinion here. So. This is just one quick representation of how high. It's not that Democrats and Republicans are in exactly the same place, but notice how strong the support is, even among Republicans, for the general concept of alternatives for lower level offenders. And when you ask about specific policies, you get these kind of results as well. Won't belabor the point, but appreciate Steve taking note of just how stark the transformation is, listening to Congressman Sensenbrenner before, in terms of where conservative leadership in this country is today versus say 20 years ago when we had Newt Gingrich, who himself now speaks very differently about this, saying very, very different things. Last couple points here. We've gone from significant growth to basically a flat prison population and slightly declining imprisonment rates. Going from growth to flatlining is one thing. Going from flatlining to actual reductions, meaningful reductions of the prison population, very different thing. And these are the 3 quick reasons why doing much more is going to be tougher. The first is, obviously, a lot of these states that have done these reforms have picked the proverbial low-hanging fruit first, looking at technical violators and other lower-level offenders. More and more reform is going to imply and implicate making changes with respect to more serious offenders. The second thing is we actually try to close down prison facilities as opposed to not building them. A very different picture with respect to opposition from local officials, unions, and others who have jobs and local economies that they believe are dependent on these facilities. Actually not, from what research is done out there, is actually not as much interdependence as people think, but that's a strong perception that shutting down a prison is a bad thing for a local community. So there's going to be opposition that will stir there. Last thing is that we really haven't had a test yet of the new political coalitions that are out there. I think it's exciting that we see so much bipartisanship and cooperation across these ideological lines, but we haven't hit the tough going yet, and ask the really deeper questions about some of these issues yet. And it'll be a real test once that happens. So, Steve, if there ever was a time, now is it.
Great, thank you so much. David, the floor is yours.
Live here. So, Adam just said we know that we can have lower prison populations and less crime. My now home state of New York is maybe the most extreme object lesson on that. You would know that, I'm not sure. It is a very positive one. 20 years of sustained crime decline in New York State, driven, of course, by that very powerful trend in New York City, with the result that we have lower prison populations, lower, in New York City anyway, jail populations, and the longest sustained crime reduction in the country. Right? So we know that's possible. To go beyond Adam's point, we actually have very good reason now to believe that not only can those things go together, but that bringing our prison population down is going to be one of the ways in which we drive further crime reductions. Because to take the Congressman's point, we now know for a fact that particularly in the neighborhoods and communities that remain, especially violent crime hotspots in the nation, that over-incarceration, and I'll talk in a minute about broken relationships with the police and other parts of the criminal justice system, are in fact criminogenic. Right? We now know that these are places that are high crime spots, in part because of the damage done to individuals, families, and communities by what we have been doing for decades now to especially lock the men in those communities up. There's a huge and horrific in the aggregate literature on this. We now know that prison does enormous damage to the individuals who carry records around with them. They have no reason to invest in school or their own personal capital. Their lifetime earnings go down. They are less likely to marry. They are less likely to support the families they had when they went into prison. Their children are more likely to go to prison and to fail school. We know that there are community level effects such that communities stop doing many of the things that communities do to prevent crime of their own accord. That kind of collective efficacy is damaged, and some of the most recent research, which is in a place like this particularly chilling, says that people withdraw from the general political process. Like they don't vote, they don't take part in civic life. One of my black minister friends said to me 15 years ago, if you want to destroy a civilization, lock it up, right? We should not be surprised by this, but we know that much of what we have been doing, especially in these hard-hit places, in the name of crime prevention, is in fact criminogenic. So we should stop doing those things, right? Doctors say first to do no harm, and criminal justice needs to learn that lesson. Somebody said during questions earlier, what about the school-to-prison pipeline? Well, we know that when we put police officers in schools, arrest rates in schools go up and kids go to jail who would not otherwise go to jail. So let's not do that, right? There's some very basic stuff here. We now know that we have always known that crime is not evenly distributed by place or demographic or location or any of those things. We now know that to quite an extreme degree. So we now know, again, particularly where we're concerned about the hotspot neighborhoods that drive most of our crime nationally, that a very small number of places drive crime. If you map crime across a city and aggregate it by, or assign it rather by, say, block face and street corner, it will turn out that over considerable periods of time, about 5% of blocks and street corners in an entire municipality will drive well over half of its serious crime. We now know that, and we know this the best about serious violent offenders, but we know that when serious violent offending is concerned, about 3, 4, 0.5% of the population in a city is at high risk for violent offending and violent victimization. Those places and those people are special, and therefore we should give them special attention. And we know enough now about those facts on the ground that any kind of crime prevention work that we do that does not attend to those facts, we should right now be thinking is off base. And in particular, coming out of traditions like zero tolerance policing, which made a positive merit out of touching as many people in a neighborhood as one could, we now know that we ought to be doing exactly the other thing. When we know those facts about these special people and places, we can mobilize communities to act on their own behalf. So again, relatively small number of these special people and places. That means that we can say to community groups, we have a problem at this corner, what could we do together? We can do problem solving around that when we have a serious violent offender. If it's more effective to have his grandmother sit down with him and say, we need you to put your guns down, than to lock him up and have the prosecutor say that on his way to prison. People smile when they hear these sorts of stories. This is being done all over the country. It works. So everything we know about the way people in neighborhoods behave says informal social control, informal neighborhood processes are far more important than the police and the courts. Therefore, we ought to build on that as much as we possibly can. I work with narcotics cops who don't believe this for a second. They believe in the gun and the badge, so here's what I do with them. It works just as well in rooms like this. If you were afraid of the police when you were growing up, raise your hand. It's interesting, if you do this with cops, more people raise their hand, but thanks. If you were afraid of your mother when you were growing up, raise your hand. Right? That's the way informal social control works, so we ought to take advantage of it as much as we can. When that doesn't work, and of course it won't always, we want people to do the right thing because they respect the law and its agents, right? So this is, again, a rapidly growing, but even now, entirely dispositive body of research and common sense understanding about what scholars call legitimacy. If you think the police are race predators, you are much less likely to do what they want you to do. We know, particularly again in our most troubled neighborhoods, that as perceptions of police misbehavior, which can include both over-policing and under-policing, but as that sense of legitimacy falls in those neighborhoods, serious crime goes up. And we have tantalizing evidence that when we do things to shift that legitimacy in the right direction, then voluntary compliance with the law, which means not only that there's been no crime, but that nobody has done anything that they will then need to be arrested and imprisoned for, legitimacy goes up, crime goes down. And we need standard social indicators on this. We track victimization, we track reported crime. We do not track nationally perceptions of legitimacy or the experience of being policed, and we ought to do that. One of the scary possibilities about the alleged national crime spike, which is not clearly at all real at this point, but there certainly are cities that are seeing elevated levels. One very disturbing possibility there is that we're seeing these increases in places that, for historical reasons, have particularly broken relationships with especially the police. They have legitimacy crises, and these may be manifesting themselves as higher rates of violent crime. We do not know this. A number of us are very concerned about this. But we want to get legitimacy right. When we can't get voluntary compliance, we want to get deterrence right. So we now know, again, for a fact, that even with serious violent offenders, if they get a clear and transparent warning that if they don't stop what they're doing, they're going to end up in trouble, that the likelihood that they will behave goes way up. So I think you mentioned the Armed Career Criminal Act earlier on. Prosecutors can't even tell what those predicate acts are. How is some guy with a gun around, walking around the neighborhood supposed to know that? If we do the analysis and we sit him down and say, we've done the analysis, you are eligible for the Armed Career Criminal Prosecution, and the next time you get caught with a gun, you're looking at 15 years mandatory federal time, we know for a fact that his offending rate goes way down. So let's tell them. And when that doesn't work, and it won't always, we ought to use our enforcement capacities as sparingly and strategically as we possibly can. And I know, because I'm on the inside, that Sally's going to talk about coerced abstinence and hope in a minute, which has found that you can do a much better job of deterring even very serious methamphetamine users by telling them ahead of time that every time they go off their probation or parole compliance, that they will be met with a small and immediate sanction. And that works dramatically better than waiting a few years and then giving them the rest of their prison sentence. And if we can do a little and get more impact, then that's better all the way around. And if we do all of those things, then we are well on our way to less crime and less imprisonment.
Sally?
Oh, thank you for that segue. Yes, well, drugs and crime are very closely linked. And to the extent that, that drugs put people behind bars, how can we basically keep them out? So, we've had lots of drug surges in our past, and in a way we're having one now. It's an opiate surge. The last time we had one of those was the late 60s, mid-70s to mid-70s, early 80s, and that ushered in kind of an era of treatment. Actually, President Nixon was quite a proponent of methadone treatment of all things. But then we moved to crack in the 80s and 90s, became a much more punitive environment, causing some of the situation that we're trying to remedy now in terms of aggressive sentencing. And now, back in the mid-2000s and now, opiates have become a problem again. And heroin is in the news, but this probably was largely the effect of a painkiller epidemic, I'll use that term, that probably started in 1995 with OxyContin and then matured, and then that drug became harder to get and harder to use and more expensive, and while heroin became less expensive and more accessible, and so that replaced it in the lives of many folks. And in fact, ground zero, it seems, for this problem is New Hampshire, which happens to be an opportune venue since now so many candidates are being inundated with stories of how the communities are being ravaged. And in fact, the mayor of the mayor of Manchester, where there were 110,000 overdoses. Excuse me, it's a town of 110,000, but 50 overdoses, lethal overdoses since January. The mayor has systematically met with virtually every candidate who's come by. The medical examiner of New Hampshire has dubbed heroin the Ebola of northern New England, but it's actually, unfortunate, tragically, everywhere. Some places more intense than others, maybe moving west. The CDC has estimated that use has doubled since 2002, and that overdose deaths have actually quadrupled. And that's for heroin. Opiate problem is even bigger. When I say opiate, I mean opiate painkillers like Vicodin, again, Oxycontin is still around, and others. So this is a problem. And the presidential aspirants have all spoken about it pretty sympathetically. Chris Christie talked about, quote, we should talk about this like an illness, not a moral failure. Rand Paul, less, more of a health problem, not an incarceration problem. Hillary Clinton just unveiled a plan last week allocating $2.5 billion for treatment and more for other kinds of coordinating efforts. Anyway, so the idea is all of them are talking effectively about diversion, which is the notion that instead of going to a jail cell, you go to a treatment slot. And I'm all for that. I think diversion is definitely the way to go, certainly relative to punishment behind bars. No question about that. But what I wanted to talk about today was how to make that treatment work better. Because there's this sense, I think, among some that it's kind of a magic bullet. And it's just not that easy. We've been diverting people since 1930, at least, and I've learned a number of lessons. And one of the lessons is that, if I could call it purely voluntary treatment, in other words, treatment, a person was referred to drug treatment sort of with no strings attached, kind of like, here's the address of the clinic, show up. That doesn't work very well. Addicts often don't show up to treatment, and the dropout rates are very, very high. We know this from civilian data. So, but what we have learned, this is the first of two lessons that I want to talk about today. What we have learned is that treatment is able to work much more effectively if patients are held accountable, if there's strings attached, and if they're monitored. And second, and this may seem paradoxical, and it's what David had referred to earlier, there are patients, and a fair number of them, who actually don't need treatment at all, which, again, I think really surprises people. They think, well, if someone's addicted, of course they need drug treatment. That's not always true. In fact, in the civilian population, most people will get off drugs on their own, drugs and alcohol on their own over time. And it's frankly the people who keep relapsing who often have comorbid psychiatric problems. So both of these points apply, that if a person ends up needing treatment, that treatment works better if there's accountability, but not everyone needs treatment. So let me start with some examples to illustrate. So in 2000, California passed something called Proposition 36. And effectively, it was a referendum to allow first and second time nonviolent offenders who were convicted of simple possession to receive probation instead of incarceration, as long as they participated in substance abuse treatment. Now, unfortunately, these treatment programs were largely toothless. And 1 in 4 of these folks, in fact, never even showed up for treatment at all. And only a third of those who did show up even completed treatment. And completion is important because it's long been known within drug treatment worlds that the longer you stay, the better you do. Retention is key. That dose of exposure is quite important. There's a lot of work people have to do. They have to stabilize themselves in many significant ways, including finding a lot of practical things, repairing family relationships, finding a job, securing social welfare benefits if they're eligible, but ideally getting a job. And it takes a while. It also takes a while to get new habits and frankly, to detox. So the overall completion rate, though, in Prop 36 was
just about 20%, which is not so good, pretty bad. In fact, the clinicians were very frustrated, and according to the UCLA investigators who did evaluations of Proposition 36, were begging to be able to apply some sanctions to these patients. And specifically what they were talking about was something called flash incarceration, which is a swift and immediate response, but not severe, in other words, not revocation of probation, 1 or 2 nights, possibly up to 10, in jail, temporary, then the person comes back out. But this is the kind, but they couldn't do anything. They couldn't even require more intensive treatment. They couldn't require anything that appeared to be a negative consequence because that was part of the Prop 36 ethos. And in fact, Prop 36 didn't even allocate money for drug testing, although they ended up getting that money from some other source. But I mean, I think that reflects how averse the authors of Prop 36 were to any kind of accountability. So now move to drug courts. I'm sure you've all heard of drug courts. They're a kind of diversion regime that has exactly what Prop 36 lacked, which is leverage. They apply swift, certain, fair, but not severe. Severity is not an issue here. Consequences for folks who give a dirty urine or are out of compliance in some way. So again, a drug court is something a person can be sent to. The idea is they finish it and the charges are dismissed, and they go through a formal treatment program, and they have these consequences. The consequences can be anything from, again, spending some time, well, actually in a jury box, or community service, possibly house arrest, more intensive probation, supervision, or this flash incarceration. And the idea is, again, the swiftness of the response. That is key, behavior 101. And then with gradually, these become more gradually severe if they have to be, if the person keeps violating. But typically that it does happen, but a lot of times it doesn't, and mostly it doesn't. And drug courts are more effective than conventional corrections. There have been a number of studies on this in helping people cut back on drug use and reoffending. Now again, wow, time really flies. Okay, so you get that idea. Let me move on. Let me move on to HOPE. When David said I'm going to talk about HOPE, it's actually an acronym: Hawaii Opportunity, Probation, and Enforcement. And to make a long story short, HOPE is now in other states, and it's a great model of swift, certain, and fair sanctions. And HOPE obeys a behavioral triage model. And this gets to the point about not everyone needing treatment, where people come in the case of HOPE, Hawaii happens to be heavy in methamphetamine, and you never expect, it's true, I have to admit, I might have never expected people who are heavy methamphetamine users, which is probably from a neurophysiological standpoint, one of the more corrosive drugs of abuse. You'd think some cognitive damage, but these folks can respond to sanctions. And in fact, treatment in Project HOPE is reserved for people who don't conform with the sanctions. And that way they get to save a lot of money on treatment, which is one of the biggest expenses of drug court, and are able to focus it on high-quality intensive care, sometimes residential, for folks who won't respond to the sanctions alone. I'm just going to give you a sense of the 40% of HOPE probationers, most of whom were seriously addicted to methamphetamine. Only 40% had any violation at all. This is during their stay. Within the first year. And I'm looking for the part about how, right, okay, so which means they were basically able to abstain on their own in an environment with known and reliable consequences. But of those, 40% only have had a second violation, and of those, with 2 violations, only half, so 10% of the total, only 10% of the total had a third or subsequent violation, which meant they got treatment. So that's an enormous savings of money that they could then put into treatment for folks. And also a much more efficient way of treating people. Drug courts, everyone talks about drug courts. The idea is great. They are effective in their way, no question, but their ability to accommodate offenders is actually quite small. They're actually quite limited, partly because they're expensive, but also because they won't take violent offenders. And there are other things they can do. But the point is that Project Hope, with Swift, Certain, and Severe, is again a counterintuitive but very effective and very efficient way of approaching. And it goes to my point that I started with, that drug treatment alone, you get lots of dropout without accountability. This is something we've learned from so many years of working with addicts in the context of criminal justice, and really should be very much part of a renewed emphasis on diversionary strategies. Thanks.
All right, well, I haven't even started. I've already been told the hook is out. So, so I'm at the Heritage Foundation, so I guess I'm part of that eclectic bunch that Congressman Sensenbrenner talked about. I testified, in fact, in front of that overcriminalization task force. I'll also say that I'm a former federal prosecutor. I spent 10 years, both as a career and a political. I don't consider myself in any way, shape, or form soft on crime. And as one might guess, since I'm at the Heritage Foundation, I'm also an unabashed conservative. So I guess let me sort of step back and say how I think we got to this perspective and give my perspectives on a realpolitik of where we're going with some of these issues now. So for a long time, people were, obviously crime was out of control, particularly in places like New York, but really across the nation in the 60s and early 70s, really up until the early 80s. And we were, people were felt as if the cities in particular were out of control and very, very unsafe. And so candidates like Richard Nixon ran on being tough on crime, and they won overwhelmingly. And so we started incarcerating more people. And the system appeared to be working pretty well. Crime leveled off in the early 90s, started dropping after that. People just assumed that it had to do with the increased incarceration rates. Nobody likes crime. Criminals, as a general matter, don't have a great political constituency. So as long as there was money around to build prisons and incarcerate more people, and crime was dropping, people were very, very happy with that. And then we had, Adam alluded to this, a few short years ago, we hit a recession, and states all of a sudden had, their prisons were over capacity, and they were costing a tremendous amount of money, and their tax revenues were shrinking, and they were discovering that their prison costs were, in many instances, the second highest budgetary item that they had, behind only Medicaid, and it was going to keep growing. There was nothing that was going to stop the rate of prison costs, in addition to facing lawsuits for prison overcrowding and the like. And so, necessity being the mother of invention, a number of states decided to look at these issues and really be very intelligent about it. And as Adam has alluded, there were a number of them were really, really red states. And they experimented in methodical ways with addressing this. Back-end reform programs, looking at their mandatory minimum sentencing, considering things like drug courts, mental health courts, veterans courts. And they have met with jury's still out, but the results so far, as Adam pointed out, look very, very promising. And a lot of these governors touch the third rail and risk being labeled soft on crime, and they live to survive. So I'm actually optimistic about all of this, because everyone's talking now about what's going on at the federal level, and federal, sentencing reform is certainly very important. But keep in mind that there are about 200,000 people incarcerated in federal prisons. There are 2 million people incarcerated in state prisons. States like what they have been doing in this area. You're not looking at too many state systems that have enacted sentencing reform and prison reform that are looking at undoing that. You're looking at the ones that are left over on Adam's map who are saying, gee, how can we save money and be perceived as being more humane and perhaps certainly not increase our crime rates, but perhaps even reduce our crime rates. And so, good for them. Now, in terms of what's going on at the federal level, it's all very exciting, right? So there appears to be this bipartisan consensus, and there are a whole bunch of issues that are being discussed, only some of which we've alluded to. There's also discussion about the quasi-criminal issue of civil asset forfeiture, and there's juvenile justice reform, and people are talking about collateral consequences. There have been some allusions made about how difficult it is for people once they're released to get on with their lives and make it less likely that they will recidivate and become law-abiding citizens. Collateral consequences certainly play a role in all of that. However, I think I'm cautiously optimistic that something will get done here at the federal level. Defeat can definitely be snatched from the jaws of victory. There are, as has been referred to by David among others, big spikes in crime going up, particularly murder rates in a number of urban areas. Congressman Sensenbrenner is from the Milwaukee area. Milwaukee crime has been out of control this summer. Places like Baltimore, drug overdoses are a big concern. And of course, there's a realpolitik impediment, which is the two people that control the gavel on most of these issues are Bob Goodlatte in the House and Chuck Grassley in the Senate, and they're not exactly big fans of sentencing reform. But I do think that things like HOPE program, which as Sally has noted, has been expanded to things like the 24/7 program in North Dakota and South Dakota. They are showing a great deal of promise. People are getting out, and when presented with frequent, in fact, daily drug and alcohol testing, and are told ahead of time they will be swift and certain punishment if you use, it will be discovered because you're going to be tested immediately. And if you are discovered and tested immediately, you are not going to be dragged in front of a judge. You're going to be carted right off to jail, which, by the way, is usually right next to the testing facility. And you will be behind bars for a day, 2 days, 3 days. So you're not going to sever your relationship with your family. You're not going to strain those moral ties. You will, in all likelihood, be able to keep your job, so you're going to maintain that opportunity. But you will be deprived of your liberty for a reasonable period of time. And if people are faced with that, as opposed to the prospect that if they engage in their 10th violation, maybe there'll be some probation revocation down the road, they won't use, even if they're not engaged in treatment. And if you string enough of those days together, all of a sudden you are no longer addicted. A couple of things before I hit my magic moment and we can get to questions. So Adam pointed out that there are a bunch of conservatives that fall into this category, which are very interesting. He referred to spiritual and biblical conservatives, people who care about focusing just on public safety, and fiscal conservatives. And I suppose there are smatterings of all three in me. I guess I would focus more on the public safety aspects in this sense, which I think that you do need to repair broken lives and get people away from the horrible circumstances or bad things that they did that ended up where they were. So the spiritual aspect is very important. Fiscal constraints. Look, there are a lot of good uses for funds, including, by the way, hiring more investigators and prosecutors and victim services. They compete for those dollars, and perhaps there are better uses of those dollars. But if, frankly, they didn't close any more prisons and they just use the money that they have now in better ways, I would be okay with that. I do, however, see that for the foreseeable future, we are not going to go on a dramatic prison building program either at the federal level or at the state level. And I view each one of those prison cells as very, very valuable real estate, whom they ought to be utilized by the people who pose the greatest continuing threat to public safety. And in my mind, we are sending too many of the wrong people away for too long and not using that resource in a very smart way. One other thing before I shut up, which is, so I guess as the only prosecutor here, there have been references to how prosecutors do things and whether they should be more sparing and strategic in terms of their enforcement. And I acknowledge that as being true. But prosecutors certainly do not see themselves as being part of the problem. They would be shocked and appalled if they were characterized that way. I think they are part of a system that is at the tail end. It's after investigations have been done and they're presented with cases. And, when you're given a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And they've been part of a system, I was part of it for a long time, that measures outcomes more than outputs. And so they're going to be based for performance based on how many people they're locking up for how long. And less on whether it has an effect in the community or not. I think the community-oriented programs, David made reference to some of them where the police get out and actually try to engage, break down this horrible Ferguson effect that we're now seeing, and prosecutors being part of that, trying to build up trust in the communities and saying, look, you know where your big problem areas are and who your big problems are. Let's try to focus on them in a methodical, smart way. I think we can end up having reductions in crime and not be so draconian in terms of the sentences that we currently impose. I think I made it 1 minute.
Very good. Very well done. I just want to make one sort of synthesizing point about really what I think everyone was saying. One common denominator is that everything everyone suggested here requires a higher level of governmental quality, right? In many cases, we're substituting throwing more resources, throwing more force, right, at problems that require more subtlety, right? So if you think about what Sally's talking about, right, we need to be much more careful about who we're using drug treatment for, right? But the drug treatment we use has to be much higher quality, right? That's in some sense the opposite of what we've been doing, which is trying to say, let's put more people into drug treatment, right? Which almost necessarily is going to be of lower quality, right? If you're trying to increase that scope. David is really talking about in the area of legitimacy, right? Getting police not just to be going down and cracking down on drug corners, right? But having to do a very complicated combination of all kinds of different disciplines, right? Social work, actual regular policing, right? All working across multiple different government agencies, right? That requires a much higher level of governmental quality, right? Than we'd have at just throwing more standard issue cops at a problem, right? All of these, I think, really require that the next step in actually, if we're really going to try and reduce incarceration more while increasing public safety, we're going to have to get better at doing government, right? That means we're probably going to have better quality people, right? And again, one of the areas that Congressman Sensenbrenner emphasized was probation and parole, right? Probation and parole officers today in most places, right, are really just there to sort of take record of someone's status, right? They're not really there doing intense work, the kind of supervision we're talking about, getting down deep into people's lives, figuring out what the problems are, right? If we're really going to be able to substitute probation and parole for a lot of policing, that whole area of public service is going to have to be improved in quality and professionalism dramatically. And that's an area that, frankly, the United States is not very good at. The United States is not very good at, across lots of areas, dramatically improving the quality of public service. In some sense, that is the challenge across all these areas in the next 10 years. And if there's something where we might not be able to do this, right, I think that is my greatest worry, right, is that we may not be able to dramatically improve the quality of government and government personnel that we need to do in order to ramp down incarceration while ramping up public safety. Okay, we have 7 minutes, more or less, for questions. So this is the lightning round.
Hi, Casey Harper, Daily Caller News Foundation. You mentioned, one of you, I can't remember which, mentioned the low-hanging fruit that states are implementing, and it's relatively easy and cost-efficient and has big results. So what would be a few of those examples of low-hanging fruit, quick, easy, more cost-effective things that states could do quickly that would have big impact?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was me. It's a really unfortunate phrase. I hate to use it, right? But it obviously makes sense for states to look toward the lowest level offenders first. If your formula is to say we want to have prisons concentrated on serious chronic violent offenders and we want to do the proverbial something else, who are those people? Really starts with where Steve just was, which is probation and parole violators. You have some states where upwards of 50% of prison admissions were people on supervision. And at least half of those going back typically for often repeated technical violations, not even new crimes. So half of half, you're looking at 25%, 30% in some states prison admissions being people who are being sent either to prison if they're on probation or back to prison if they're on parole for breaking the rules. And I don't think anybody's saying that those people shouldn't be held accountable. There are swift and certain sanctions, and we've talked about a number of the options there. But hold them accountable without jamming them back in a $30,000 a year taxpayer-funded prison cell. And then next, obviously, is the nonviolent offenders, drug offenders, and property offenders. And many of those states, including states like Utah just earlier this year, taking a look at first and second-time drug offenders, particularly possession offenders, and just saying across the board, these are no longer felonies in this state. They're going to be addressed and people are going to be held accountable, but we're not going to use a state prison cell for those types of offenders anymore.
All right. Right behind, right here, gentlemen. Yes, you.
Thank you. So in Los Angeles, there's been a crime spike. They've had, past 12 years, it's been on the decline, and then most recently, it's gone up. And after the passage of Proposition 47, which reclassified a lot of felonies as misdemeanors, a lot of people have been saying criminal justice reform is why we have increased crime. So could any of the panel talk about that and like the perceived risks? Like if crime is going down, our arguments about criminal justice reform is really good. But if crime goes up, it can be a harder argument to make, especially after these reforms are made.
Maybe David, you want to take that one?
I'm happy to comment, but go right ahead.
Criminal justice reform turns out to be so damaging that it causes impact in other states and cities. When you have 3 months of increased numbers in one place, anybody who says they know why that is going on is a fraud. You cannot tell anything about what's happening in any of these places that are having spikes based on what we know right now. If what we're going on in LA were the result of state-level policy, we should expect to see it in Sacramento and Oakland and San Francisco and all these other places. We're not seeing it there. And my rudeness about this applies to all the other cities and all the other things that people are saying about what's going on right now because nobody knows.
Let me make I'm sorry if I could comment on that briefly. There's a potential problem with this, Jordan, which is if you make all of these property offenses now misdemeanors or you drop them from being felonies to misdemeanors, one, you can't compel people to get into drug treatment, and two, property crime is likely to rise. California, though, is a very unusual situation in that it's very difficult to disaggregate Prop 47, I guess it was, from what happened in the Plata decision. So the Supreme Court upheld a California Supreme Court order that forced very large numbers of offenders, many more than they could safely do in terms of nonviolent offenders, back out of prison and into the communities. And they gave the communities very little money and very little time to equip themselves to absorb those people in sensible ways. So you are seeing spikes in crimes. I would contend that it is probably far more likely to do with the messiness of trying to address the Plata decision and all that caused in the state than it is Prop 47. And in fact, Prop 47 was an attempt to try to bring down the prison excess capacity in a sensible way by dealing with, as Adam referred to, the relatively low-hanging fruit so that they could keep those prison cells for the people whom they unfortunately were letting out in the immediate wake of the Plata decision.
Adam?
I just wanted to add quickly that one of the themes that you heard across this panel, I think each one of us said something about swiftness and certainty being more important than severity. And so just be thinking about when you hear people say, and it's often police chiefs and others who are saying these kind of things, that it's the severity, we don't have such severe punishments anymore, that the research is frankly couldn't be clearer about the certainty of detection and apprehension being far more important deterrents to criminal behavior than whether or not you get a 13-month or a 11-month sentence.
Right. Go ahead.
Hi, Brianna Weldon with the Charles Koch Institute. Thanks for taking my question. John, actually, I was wondering if you could expound a little bit more on how we might better engage with prosecutors looking forward. I have prosecutors attend our events and will speak to me afterwards saying we really want to be a part of this conversation. I think we do ourselves a disservice if we paint them or allow them to be painted as the bad guys in this equation. So how would you say that we could better bring them into this reform movement?
Hard to do. I would say that at least at the federal level at the moment that there is a small minority actually of prosecutors, but they're the vocal small minority of prosecutors who are objecting to any mandatory minimum reform. Look, prosecutors will basically obey the rules, and for a long time they were operating under the so-called Ashcroft memo, which was put in place when I was at the Justice Department, that required prosecutors to charge the highest easily provable offense, which prosecutors took correctly so, as saying if I can prove that a mandatory minimum offense was committed, I have to charge it. Former Attorney General Holder did away with that and has returned some more discretion to prosecutors, federal prosecutors, and they've taken advantage of that. I stress when I have these discussions and saying, look, even without so many minimum mandatory offenses, there are still big incentives for little fish who have information to come in and cooperate against bigger fish. That's what you always hear prosecutors say. I need that heavy hammer to get little fish to cooperate against bigger fish. There are lots of incentives built into the system that would still push people to do that sort of cooperation. I would also point out, at least at the moment, that the discussions that are going on are not talking about eliminating mandatory minimum penalties. They are talking about cutting them back, and they are certainly talking about expanding the safety valve, which by definition will apply to the lowest level of offenders. And also I will point out that, because some people object to the phrase non-violent drug offenders, they think every drug offender has certainly the potential for violence, and they object to that classification, that at the moment at least the discussions that are going on are not talking about reducing mandatory minimum penalties for any offense that results in death or serious bodily injury. So I talk about this as a more measured step that will still give them, it'll be a fairer system and still give them a lot of the incentives that they look for.
Right, and again, this is our last point since we're over time. One of the things I think, especially in policing and with prosecutors, we can take an approach where we basically paint them as the enemy, right? We try and regulate them, we try and control them. I'm not sure that's the answer in policing, right? I mean, the policing, the trick is to give police something else to do, right? Rather than simply to regulate out the thing you don't want them to do. And I think a lot of what David's work is about, giving them something else to do and teaching them how to do something new that in some ways will make them more satisfied, will give them more professional dignity. I think the same thing is true for prosecutors, right? Right now, prosecutors don't have a lot of tools for thinking about how to apply their scarce resources that they're sending people to in a way that has the highest public safety, right? That's one of the things you're saying is they have this mechanical rule that basically says they always have to charge up as much as they can, right? I think a lot of prosecutors would like to have more discretion, right? But they would have to know how to use it. And we don't train prosecutors to think about the allocation of those resources in the ways that have the highest public safety benefit. Most prosecutors don't even really have that information available to them. And if it was available to them, they didn't have the ability to use it, right? Again, those are all cases where we have to transform the way we think about these professions, make them in some sense more professional, give people more professional dignity. That's all in a way making the job harder, right? And getting even better people that are going to have to be able to do those kinds of jobs. Okay, we're at 4.
There's one other very, very quick point, which is, so there are some people on the left who are part of this eclectic bunch who do, in my mind, tend to demonize prosecutors and police officers. And I actually think that is completely counterproductive, because if you do demonize police officers and prosecutors who view themselves correctly so as dedicated public servants who are trying to do the right thing, then you will cause conservatives to run for cover, and that will poison the well in terms of this bipartisan moment that we're at.
Well, that in fact is the last word on the subject. I want everyone to thank our panelists.
It's a pleasure.